Okay, we'll call it to order, and it is 7:59. And I think our first order of business is to look at Peter Galatano's minutes from the 25th. Did anybody have any changes or corrections?
I did not.
I didn't either. Peter Galatano, it was a good template. We'll just
Yeah,
fill in a new date.
Just keep recycling it. That's
Okay. Then would someone like to make a motion to accept the minutes?
I so motion.
And a
Second.
second?
second.
All in favor? We have to call our name and say yay or nay, since we're on Zoom. I'll Corey Lincoln and I'll say yes.
Peter Morris, I say yes.
Peter Galatano, and I say yes.
3-0. Sounds good. We have two items of business tonight. One is kind of a rehash of what we talked about in our last meeting about changing the date of the deadline for submitting your capital budget request. And we had agreed, we had voted 3-0 that we were going to change the date to January 1. It was pointed out to me that January 1 is always a holiday, and that this year, and so actually then we were going to move it to January 2nd, but this year, because the holiday is on a Sunday, the 2nd is also a holiday. So at the outline of the town schedule, it's going to read January 3rd is the deadline. It does raise the question, I don't know, we are going to propose a warrant article with the January 1 date. And should we just leave it January 1 and change it around on the town calendar, depending upon how the holidays fall? Or should we pull it back and make it December 31st, which will never be a holiday, the last day of sobriety?
Can't you put it as the first business day of the current year?
We could do that.
I mean, for the benefit of those who are submitting, does it matter if it's December 31st or, January 2nd or 3rd? I mean, if it gives them more time, and we're not going to look at it anyways on, say, January 1st, or then I just assume give it until the next business day, as Peter had suggested.
Okay, we can do that.
If a lot of us are going to be looking at it on January 1st, that's our New Year's resolution, then roll it back perhaps. But if we're not, then we might as well make it the next business day. So,
okay, why don't we call it the first business day after January 1st? Is that an okay phrase?
Sounds good.
Yes.
Okay, and that's part one. Part two that has been raised is changing the definition of a capital item. Right now, it's anything over $10,000 that will last a minimum of 5 years. And the subject came up of, and actually Heidi, the town treasurer, raised this with me for the first time about increasing it to $25,000, keeping the same 5-year limit of life. And I think, Peter Galatano, it was discussed at your advisory meeting, was it not?
Yes, it was.
Okay, do you want to kind of sum up the pros and the cons?
Yes, there was a heavy favor of moving it to 25,000 for reasons of inflation, ease of lessening the burden, because everyone else wanted it. And I was the lone dissenter that said keep it at 10,000 for transparency, tracking, and good stewardship of assets.
Okay, thank you. I do have to tell Peter Moores that, and incidentally, Peter Moores, have you had a chance to look at the town bylaws at all?
So the bylaws that apply for capital budget, I've read all of those through. I
Okay.
haven't read all the bylaws of the town at this point.
Good. I just wanted to make sure you knew where to find them. If you noticed the particular piece that discusses the dollar limit was said it was amended in 1987.
1986, or
Yeah, 87. So I know someone did kind of a back of the envelope quickie estimate of from 1987 till now, what does inflation do to
It's
$10,000?
approximately $26,680 or something, according to an internet calculator I use.
Oh,
So,
thank you very much. That's more than back of the envelope. So that struck me as probably the strongest pro issue. It will shift the degree of due diligence that advisory will have to do on capital items that are between 10 and 25,000. Won't affect anything less than 10. They've always had to look at those. So Peter, would you be distressed if we went ahead and recommended 25?
Well, I don't think it would be good fiscal stewardship if we did. Looking at comparable towns our size, there was a number that had a $10,000 limit. A small town called Dover that's proximate to us. Millis, and I sent the list around earlier.
Yes.
And then there were larger towns that had a 25,000. Weston was a smaller one that had $25,000 limit. And then Sudbury was an outlier. And then we didn't, Deb didn't do any of the large cities.
Okay.
But again, my point being, and there were other reasons like inflation, which I don't think holds much water, that support keeping it at the level it's at. And again, it was transparency, good stewardship for assets, because once you capitalize them, you have to track them and then dispose of them versus a pay-as-you-go item that you can just not track it, not dispose of it, and not transparently show the town what we're seeking for in terms of capital expenditures. And so it's converting a significant amount, if you use the 25,000 of operating expense as pay as you go for these capital items, which could alter the budget significantly, because each department for each item under 25,000 could put it in their budget and justify it just through the normal budget review. And for those of us that have enjoyed that budget review, it's a concentrated 6 to 8 week period of looking at many, many budgets, multiple lines over multiple years, trying to trend expenses, working with the budget makers, asking those tough questions of, can you use it? What is the use for those increases year over year? Not that it can't be done, but again, with other towns keeping it at our level, I don't know when they picked their number. Maybe we were just so progressive that we knew a long time ago what that right number should be. But again, I think from a voter's perspective, from a tracking perspective, the current level is adequate.
Is there any reason, Peter, why advisory could not ask the budget maker? And we're budget makers who come in with capital requests that are over 10 and under 25. Basically, we're talking about 3, possibly 4 budgets that do that. Is there any reason why you could not ask them to have a separate line in their budget that is the sort of quasi capital items that they could be set aside and then subject to the same requirements as, like, 3 bids, justification, that kind of thing, so that they could get the same eyeball that they do through the capital process now?
Well, I learned from Sean Colleen the other night that regardless of where our threshold is, that there's still the requirements of 3 bids using the state contractor, taking advantage of the state's purchasing power. So that is still an obligation of the budget makers. And yes, from an accounting perspective, I'm sure, and I would yield to Deb on the general ledger and how to account for these items. But that is one of many accounts that we look at, again, over multiple years, seeing the trends for each department. And as some know, each department has anywhere from 15 minutes, 20 minutes to multiple nights, depending upon what their ask is and the size of their department. So it would add another layer of complexity to an already complex budget review.
So I just had a quick question. I mean, so what we're talking about changing is the items that are, capital budget from 10 to 25. Is that historically, or at least in the last 2 or 3 years, been a large number of items, or are we talking about most capital improvement or capital budget items are in excess of 25,000 anyways?
From the write-ups, and usually I've written up a few of those, they're bifurcated. Some are at the lower end for DPW and the fire department that needs their OSHA required items, and DPW that needs their equipment, to the big ticket, the larger ticket items, which are usually vehicles for police, fire trucks. So there tend to be at both ends of the spectrum, with some falling in the middle, depending upon how they aggregate the cost. There may be multiple items to a request. And some that come to mind are the fire department that needed scuba equipment, and then tanks and places to hold them, and all these OSHA requirements for firefighters when they go to fight fires, to have a separate breathing apparatus.
I see we've got 2 yellow hands up. Nora, yours was up first. Why don't you go ahead?
Hi, I just wanted to let Peter know I'm being a junior member here. Even before Peter spoke, I concur with him on the 10K. So he is not the lone person. So I put that in the chat even before you spoke, Peter. So thank you for that email. But looking at the other towns, and I believe in transparency, and I just think, in my opinion, it sends not a great message just to say whatever the semantics are from 10 to 25K. I just think that keeping it at 10K would be my recommendation also. Thank you. And
Sean,
I'm sorry, I'm at a public place and mute myself.
No problem. Thank you, Nora. Sean, you had your hand up.
I did. Some of it's a comment, some of it's an answer to the last question. I'll start with the answer to the last question. The past few years, at least on the DPW side, we've had a handful of items, just north of 10,000, but not significantly north, that I had to group together, because alone they just, it makes no sense to clutter up the town meeting warrant with 6 or 8 items, that are $10, $12, $14,000 that really don't meet the threshold of what we should be voting on, especially if it's going to be end up on the ballot. You know, if we don't group these things together, we could end up with a ballot with 12 questions. And, you know, that ends up adding a lot of complexity on the tail end, trying to figure out the ballot for the select board and advisory. So it's not like we don't discuss these things. We consider them all. And then further on that, the town buildings capital article is littered with items that are way south of 25,000, and we group it all together to put several $100,000 together. We've argued back and forth over the past couple of years of where we should do that, and that's where we kind of wax and wane with our capital versus our operating budget. We'll continue to have those discussions, but we're nowhere close to using that threshold on the capital for facilities. We buy things all the time and put them to the capital article, probably wrongfully, but we do. But as far as, I mean, you need to take into context, a snowplow we purchased this year was $13,000. It was just an upgrade to a snowplow that we've completely destroyed. It was 18 years old. We're keeping the truck. We purchased one. In 1987, a snowplow was not $13,000, so it wouldn't have ever made the threshold. Nor should it end up on the ballot, right? We buy trucks that are $500,000, $600,000, $700,000. A snowplow shouldn't be on the same ballot that a truck is. So those are operational expenses that end up, you know, that could be in the snow and ice. That happens to be in a revolving fund that we spent that from, but nevertheless, those things don't really rise to that. What it adds in complexity right now, if you picture the last few weeks of the year for me, the guy that has more capital articles than anyone else, I'm trying to decipher what I'm going to need the whole next season, right? And in January, I'm going to throw at you this list of things that I need. You want prices and quotes and estimates on things that, frankly, none of those contract prices are going to be valid July 1st. They actually roll over in the spring because they all got rebid, but nevertheless, we want those things. We want those numbers. So I have to jump ahead of when I'm actually assessing where I might end up. I might be putting things out to bid for operational stuff like mowing, and that might fall through, and then I need to buy a mower. So a lawnmower right now is over $10,000. I happen to buy one just south of it at the tail end of this year to finish the year because the subcontractor fell through, but that's the level we're at. Lawnmowers and snowplows is $10,000. That's not where they were in '87, and nor do we want to be littering town meeting floor and the ballot that should have school capital articles and town building articles and trucks for $1 million mixed with $10,000 snowplows and mowers. That's where we're at. Thanks.
Thank you, Sean.
One question, Sean. You said that you had to bundle last year lower items. Why wouldn't you have expensed them like we're trying to do now this year?
No, I bundled. I've done this each year. I've bundled 3 or 4 different items into one capital article. You remember 2 or 3 years ago, I did one for like non-highway related equipment and one for highway related equipment. I needed a roller and a trailer with a roller and a compactor and some other things. So each one of them were more than 10,000 perhaps. So it was, but I didn't, rather than do an article for one item at 11,000, another item at 12,000, another item at, 15,000. I did one article and we grouped them all together.
Right, but the write-up was for each individual one. And I think I did them. And I appreciate the work savings, but that's job security for the advisory committee, is to ensure that the money's going for the right. And then for projecting costs, whether it's capital or expense, you still have to project your cost so far out because you have to put it in your budget, and it can be wrong on the expense side or on the capital side, but you still have to make an educated guess by March.
I'm not
So,
sure I follow.
Well, if it comes before the capital
I
committee
don't
or
have- Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, go ahead. No, but the point I was trying to make is that we have the all town meeting in March, and we have to know the capital numbers and the budget numbers. And you may not need those items, yes, given for another year, but you still have to come up with a number. So even though it's operational expense, you still have to make a subject matter expert estimate for those expenses, regardless of how it's funded.
That's true. I do that constantly. It's the question of at what point do you want to get into that level? I mean, I spent $10,000. I spent $13,000 today. I spent $10,000 filling the salt shed the other day. Did you want to review that? I mean, the question is, where does the operation?
If it has a life of
towards
5
capital?
years, we should, but salt doesn't
it
usually
doesn't, and
last
neither-
that long.
And frankly, neither does a lawnmower that actually costs $11,000 or $12,000. So that's the point. At what point is it operation and not capital? And we do not track the future capital. Like, we don't depreciate an $11,000, $12,000, $13,000 mower. It's $25,000 the limit. Once we buy it, it's not a capital article on the books. Ask Deb or Heidi. It's not on the books.
So if it doesn't last 5 years, you don't have to capitalize.
Well, if it lasts 5 years and it's $13,000, we still don't capitalize it. We run it through the capital budget committee, but we don't capitalize it.
So just.
It's not a
quick
capital
timeout.
asset on the books.
I mean, I think what you're saying is that you don't actually track it as it's intended to be tracked, as Peter was talking about earlier.
DOR
Right.
does not recognize it as a capital asset unless it's $25,000 in 5 years' life.
I'm sorry, who doesn't?
The Department of Revenue.
Revenue.
So
State.
we buy it, but it's gone. It's not on the books, correct? I'm looking at
Yeah.
Heidi or Deb to join
Yeah,
in.
no, that,
I got to
yeah.
review that list every year, and there's nothing on
yeah,
my list.
no,
in 25.
that's correct. And it's really not even the DOR. It's just our audited financial statements. So what we do is at the end of the year, we just go through and make a list of anything over $25,000 that has a value of $5,000 or more. And then the auditors adjust our books for audited financial statements. It has nothing to do with our operating expenses, nothing to do with anything else like that. That's kind of a separate piece. So the whole, capitalization as such doesn't affect what you're doing right now. I mean, if
But
it's a capital
recorded. Go ahead, I'm sorry, Jeff.
if it's what we say, if it's a capital article and it's funded either by free cash or a bond, then it doesn't become part of the operating expense. So when when we go through the capital articles, like what you're doing here, and it's $15,000 that we then have to decide how we're going to pay for it. Do we pay for it with free cash, or do we pay for it out of using a bond? Those are our two options when we propose it as a capital article. If we propose it as a part of the operating budget, we're going to have to raise an appropriate money to cover that expense at that time. So that's really where the crux of the matter is how do we want to pay for all this? It has nothing to do with capitalizing it or not capitalizing it.
Okay, so I have a question. Peter made a comment earlier that's saying if it comes through our committee, it hits that $10,000 threshold, then it is tracked in the future to make sure it has been capitalized, like everything has been done properly. And they compared that to if it's something's just sort of in the operating expenditures in the budget. Is that true? That like if it comes to our committee, then it is tracked?
No,
It's
if it's
my
under
point, it's not.
25,000, I'm sorry, Sean, if it's under
Go ahead.
$25,000, it is not tracked.
So there's no town requirement to track anything that comes through the capital budget as a capitalized item.
No, there is not. If
All
it's under, this changed probably 3 years ago. David Williams made the change that it used to be anything over $10,000 we would track. Then he changed it to anything over $25,000 is what we tracked. And that's our town policy.
though it is recorded when the town votes for it as a capital item, and it's certified that the town voted for it. So into perpetuity, it's recorded as a town vote on a capital item. Now, the accounting treatment, I
that's where it gets.
disagree with, but that's water under the bridge.
End, though, that there's no additional scrutiny on the back end in terms of how the money was being spent or tracked if it's under $25,000. Like if it's above $25,000, it's going to be tracked, but if it's below $25,000, it's not going to be tracked.
That's correct.
Okay. So like, to me, that is kind of an important difference. You know, when we talk about if it was through the capital budget and then it's going to be tracked, if you're telling me it's not going to be tracked anyways, if it's below $25,000, then some of that financial scrutiny is not going to be there anyways.
And to be quite honest, I mean, I'm not sure who would be scrutinizing it anyway. I mean, it's like our asset listing is done at the time of the audit. And,
Right.
you know, the 15 years I've been here, nobody has ever asked to see the audit list, other than the auditors look at it. I send it to all the department heads and say, have you disposed of any of this? If so, we need to take it off of our books. But nobody besides that is really scrutinizing it whatsoever.
So, I mean, I haven't been able to pull up what the town budget was in 1987. I started searching for it. But I do think that, you know, the point is well taken that $10,000 is sort of the equivalent of more than $25,000 today. And so if we think that $10,000 was the appropriate level in 1987, and we want to keep it at that sort of level today, then I think it makes sense to adjust it. If we just absolutely just, you know, on an absolute scale, think that we need more scrutiny below, then I think it should drop, you know, to something less than $25,000. But I'm okay with raising it up to $25,000. I think the other towns, you know, if we did a snapshot, if the other towns were looking at us last year or even today, they'd say, oh, well, Sherborn only has a $10,000 limit, so we shouldn't raise ours. But, you know, tomorrow it'll be $25,000, and maybe the other towns will say, oh, well, we should be $25,000 too. I'm not sure I put much stock in how closely they're tracking inflation in the other towns, as you know.
I have to say, I generally agree with you, Peter, that in 1987, I wonder, whenever the $10,000 limit was set, they thought it was going to stand for 35 years. And whatever, you know, gets done this year at town meeting might conceivably be standing for another 35 years. And I think sooner or later, all those $10,000 towns are going to become 25 or even larger numbers than that. Anybody have anything to add?
I think Jeremy has his hand raised.
Oh, he does. I'm sorry, Jeremy. I didn't see it.
Okay. No,
Your yellow hand is fading into your white woodwork.
Yes. I'm just kind of observing a bit and just kind of learning your capital process, and certainly want to offer some observations as time goes on. But I just wanted to just build on the, you know, though the audited financial statements and the accounting, you know, may not look for, you know, an inventory of things that are valued less than 25,000. It's good practice to have an inventory of your equipment down to a smaller level, you know, at just sort of at a department operating best practice. So, you know, I'm sure departments know the equipment and items they have on hand. So to track, to make sure that they're, you know, they're still there, they're being put to good use and so forth, you know, whether or not they need to be added into, you know, the actual asset values that are on the accounting books. So those are two different things, in my opinion.
Any other yellow hands? Well, do you think we ought to accept a motion and vote on this? Peter and Peter?
So I You mean accept a motion or make a motion?
You could make a motion. and
I
Get us
just,
moving.
I don't know if there was one already out there that I could second or so.
No, there is not one on the floor.
Okay, so I guess I would make the motion to propose a change to the bylaw to raise the level from $10,000 threshold up to $25,000.
Thank you. Okay. Second, that has to be me. Okay, those in favor individually.
Peter Morris says yes.
Corey Lincoln.
Peter Galatano, nay.
Corey Lincoln says yes. Sorry, Peter G.
No, that's the way government works.
Works.
I
2-1.
don't know if I have a vote, but Nora says nay.
Peter G is feeling supported.
Thank you.
Yes. Probably it would be best to fold these two items together because they're really not changing new items or new intent in the chapter. It's kind of tweaking the language. It's updating two numbers. So I think we could fold them together safely in one warrant article. It's really not good practice for either advisory or capital budget to sponsor a warrant article because particularly advisory theoretically is they're voting to recommend or not to recommend all the warrant articles. So I actually kind of ran this by Jeannie, and she said she thought there would be no difficulty running this through the select board and that they would be the sponsor. Ultimately, the select board puts its endorsement on all the warrant articles that come through the town departments, that they could start out sponsoring this one. And she volunteered to actually draft it for us if we needed that. It's going to be a pretty simple draft. So unless anyone has any objection to that, I'll go ahead and pursue it that way. Does anyone feel that we should be separating these two items?
No,
Okay,
I think you should.
I beg pardon?
I think you should.
Okay, that sounds like Sean.
It was Sean. And just out of consider, like, why do you think they're, because one's raising the threshold, which perhaps is more contentious versus changing the date, but did you have an issue with changing the date?
I think they're two completely separate issues. Well, changing the date to the first weekend in the year guarantees that I'm going to be working my tail off the week between Christmas and New Year's. I'm going to be emailing everyone on this call constantly. There's a lot of work that goes into both the budget and the capital budget. And to expect me and the other budget makers to spend New Year's Eve finishing it isn't really fair when you know you're not going to look at it. Admittedly, you're not going to look at it, so I'm going to rail against it. If you want to do it in November, that's fine, but to make it the first week of January is just not fair to the staff that has to get that work done that undoubtedly doesn't get looked at till mid-January.
Well, you could solve that problem by looking at it in early December.
Well, there's more to it than just throwing it together, right? There's a lot of staff that has to feed to it. There's a lot of reports that need to be done. There's a lot of work in the background that needs to get done, and you back everything up. Everything I do needs to be supplemented by things that Deb does, etc. And you know, there's only a certain amount of time between guidance, between the initial budgets coming out, finalizing the budgets, and sometimes it's a scramble to get that done. And then you need all the backup, and the backup often needs to be done by people outside of Sherborn for the capital articles, right? You need quotes, you need bids, you need a lot of things done, and people aren't answering the phone between December 25th and January 1st. So you set yourself up for failure.
Did I hear you say that you would be happy to do it in November?
Well, I'd
be
happy to not. I don't think they should be pinned together because I'm going to rail against one and I'm going to rail for the other.
Well, would you prefer to have the date be December 1?
I would prefer to separate them, yeah.
No, I'm asking if you would prefer to have the date be December 1, the deadline for submission?
I'm not sure, but January 1st is just an undue burden on the staff.
Sean,
Bad enough for
obviously
the
the
budgets.
current request is give or take January 3rd. Are you intending on meeting that deadline this year? Or
For which?
technically 2023, next year?
For capital or for budgets?
Capital.
I have no intention of meeting January 1st for capital. Nor was it the expectation, was it?
Yes, it was in your letter that you received this year.
Well, I'll give it a shot, but the budgets have to be in by January 1st by the bylaw. I'm not quite, I need to meet with a lot of people between now and when I put the capital through, to be honest with you. I'm not sure what's going to be on there right now.
We'll have
I'm,
difficult.
no, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Corey.
No, I
gonna
was
make a
going to
motion.
say we'll have great difficulty evaluating your capital budget request if we don't have the complete paperwork done.
All due respect, you started in late February last year. Did you not?
With all due
That's why we're
respect,
changing it.
we sent you a letter in this year early on with a very clear warning about what the deadline was going to be. And we stated our reasons for changing it, and we asked for everyone's cooperation. And we have a very tight schedule because we're trying to complete our work before advisory does their work and not do duplicate things simultaneously. It's to your benefit.
I understand, but the capital on the facilities depends a lot on advisory's decisions on some of the budget. So there's been a lot of budget meetings, and Peter can attest to this on the operating budget that's played into the capital. So to do them both at the same time is great too, but you're signing advisory up for a lot of input that I'm not
No,
quite sure they're ready to do in
we
December.
have been doing them at the same time. We'd like to do capital first and then advisory.
Yeah, this was a genesis from advisory to line it up this way. So
I understand.
Deb,
Yes?
are you leaving?
No. I was just turning off my camera.
Okay, Jeannie has her hand up.
I just wanted to, in the bylaw for capital budget, the date is a different section than the amount of money that's necessary. So it doesn't have to be kind of squashed together into one change. You can just amend both sections of the bylaw.
And two different, are you saying to do it in two different warrant articles?
No,
Oh.
you can amend the bylaw as one warrant article, you would just list each section that you're changing.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Jeremy,
Yeah, a couple things. In general, it is good practice to consider your capital before your operating budget. It's just not necessarily, it's not set up that way in the town's bylaw. So, but if you look at best practices that are recommended from DOR and what other communities do that have good, well-established financial procedures, they do consider their capital budget first prior to their operating budget. And they're separately submitted. And I agree that, trying to submit both budgets on the same date is problematic for the staff. There's a lot that goes into both budgets to have them due on the same date. Certainly something that you may want to consider going into next year, to have, either the same date or different dates, but I don't know when the expectation was set by all, so I shouldn't speak to that. But in general, having an operating budget due January 1st, there's a lot of assumptions that go into it. There's a lot of numbers that we don't know yet. We won't have firm numbers on the town's insurance until later in January. So when we submit a budget, relatively early, January 1st, for operating, there's a lot of assumptions inherent in that, and it's not as sharp a budget as it can be. And necessarily it will likely get revised as we head into town meeting. Just a heads up there. And that's, one reason that some communities are delaying some submissions of their operating budget. For instance, the town I just came from moved their submission of their operating budget from January 1st to mid-February, I think. They moved it about 6 weeks later so that they'd have the benefit of better numbers before the budget was published and before their finance committee or advisory committee started reviewing. And their submission of capital was actually, they have their capital is due by the beginning of December. So they separate the two budgets by a fair amount of time. But that's been an established practice. So that's sort of the routine that the folks there have gotten into. I'd agree. I think this, if it's as far as a town meeting article, it's likely best to have it as one article, but it's, the items are separately listed and spelled out. And if somebody on the floor wants to add or remove one of those items, they can certainly do that. But, likely it would be presented as one warrant article. And if the selectmen choose to sponsor it, they would kind of be at their discretion as well. So just adding that. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeremy. Peter Galatano, when the issue of the deadlines first came up last year in advisory, I remember that one of the suggestions was actually to make the capital deadline December 1st. Do you remember that? Do you remember why that kind of fell by the wayside?
I don't. The recollection was to move it in the order that we're aiming for is simultaneously, so that everything is in hand when we start the 3 months, January, February, March, and March is really the end. At the Ides of March, we usually have our big meeting. So, Jeremy, it does ebb and flow. There's some fluidity to the budget, even if something's on the paper January 1st and new information comes up. There's multiple meetings for the larger departments that are more than just trend budgeting. So that is not uncommon, but it is always seems to be a pretty tight time frame to get January, February, March, get the write-ups to be published by the notice periods for the town meeting. And so it in my 7 years, it just seems that there's never enough time. And there never is, because, given unlimited time, the budget would be perfect, but we don't have that. The best time to do a budget is after the year when we know all the expenses.
Okay.
But
I'll vote for that, Peter. Thank you.
Well, last year we actually, and up until this point, we've done it sort of backwards. We've actually had the operating budget was January 1st and capital was February 1st. And what we're attempting to do is to flip that around so that the capital piece is taken care of first before the operating piece. If the operating budget deadline is going to remain at January 1st, and I think that's kind of a sliding target, as I recall from my time on advisory, maybe we should consider moving the deadline in the bylaw for capital to December the 1st so that they wouldn't collide on the same due date.
Yeah, I mean, I think, based upon what I'm hearing from Jeremy and the sort of burden upon the staff, if we're thinking about large capital, again, over $25,000 expenditures that are going to have a lifetime of at least 5 years, pushing it back a month to December 1st. I mean, you're hopefully thinking big picture, big ticket items, far enough in the future that the 30 days wouldn't be material.
Okay. And we're talking about setting this for next year. I mean, the change to the warrant article is going to be for next year. You're already late, Sean.
Nothing for us to do this year, right? We didn't get any submissions by December 1st.
Well, you can make it December 1st, and I have nothing It's gonna be really easy.
Okay, what if we reconsider the deadline and if we move it back to December 1st? Does that make more sense if we're trying to precede the operating budget deadline?
Honestly, I think it does. We talked about this for years, David, myself, and others. It tripping over trying to figure out the operating budget and having the amount of work that goes into, especially for someone like me that's trying to do multiple capital articles, it's unbearable.
Okay,
And
well,
I mean, you've seen the results of it. It was later in January. Again, the validity of the numbers that you're going to get from November for something that's going to be purchased July, a year late, the following July, you got to take that into account.
yeah,
Sometimes the numbers aren't going to be perfect, but at least you got the ask in, and that gets the ask in before the warrant closes. Also, that's the other problem is we're tripping over the warrant deadline, which is January.
it changes from year to year, but it's usually
No, but
around the
this year
10th.
it's already fixed. Is Jeannie
Yeah.
still on? So the warrant's going to close. Last year the warrant closed before the capital articles were due. So Jeremy saw it. I still have it on my whiteboard. Some of the, my list of articles that I always have up on my whiteboard that I start in August and hope make it. So it would be helpful to
Okay.
stretch that out. Again,
Okay.
the world we live in, I do want to mention, we approved through this process a truck 2 years ago at town meeting. Ford finally has kind of officially accepted the order, and they'll let me know how much it's going to cost on the state bid number, I think this month. So we're still a little out of kilter with how things should happen.
Yeah. Well, it's never going to be perfect. And what we just need is a good baseline to sort of give a general picture of where it's going to be. So understand the problem. Peter and Peter.
There aren't any other budget, makers or requesters at this meeting, right? I mean, I know we have Sean's view, but is there anybody else with December 1st negatively impacts?
Peter, none of the other department heads complain. That's just why Sean's on this one, because he speaks for the DPW, and that's what he speaks for. But no, he's right. It's a huge, heavy lift for large departments with multiple needs, and so if I can sum it up, we're aiming towards moving the capital budget date a year from now, so the next guidance letter, to December 1st, and increasing the capital threshold for the capital threshold dollar amount to 25,000. Those are the two legs to the. It's not a stool with two legs, but two legs to the warrant, I guess.
Stilts. It's stilts.
Yeah, the stilts. So the two legs to the stilts.
Should we make it the first business day after December 1st to include December 1st if it's a business day?
No, we work on weekends. It's not a holiday.
Let's just call it December the 1st. And if that's a Sunday, we understand. We'll accept on the 2nd. Anybody want to make a motion for that? Peter?
I moved
What you just said.
Yes, December 1st for the capital budget paperwork and requirements, and increase the threshold to capital to $10,001. Oh no, I'm sorry.
I don't think he's going to go second to that one.
All right. 25,000 for the threshold. 25,000.
There is
Second
That's motion.
December 1st submission deadline and $25,000 threshold amendment to bylaws.
Okay, all in favor? I'm Corey Lincoln. Aye.
Peter Galatano, aye.
Peter Moore's aye.
Thank you, gentlemen. Actually, let's see, we've accepted the minutes from last time and we just did this. And I think that takes care of all our business. Unless anybody has any new business they want to raise.
The next meeting, is that January 1st when we review all the capital budgets?
Oh, yeah. Let's see.
Peter, are
what's-
we having breakfast New Year's Day?
Sure, the griddle.
We should review all of my articles in person.
Our next meeting is January 10th,
January 10th.
police and fire.
Do we have any expectation they're gonna submit by January 1st? I'm not sure if they're allowed to talk to us, but.
They're very organized. I think they will.
Okay. That's
Okay.
all of our business. Do I move to adjourn? Is that how it works?
You can do
I
it.
will second that motion.
And I'll say Corey Lincoln, I.
Peter Galatano, aye. Unanimously moved.
And it's 8:50.
Approved.
We did it again, trying to have meetings under an hour.
Nice job.
All right,
Okay.
everybody have a nice
Happy
holiday.
holidays. Yes, happy
Thank
holidays to
you.
everyone. Thank you all.
Everybody.
Yes, Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
Bye.
Merry Christmas. Bye-bye.
Good night,
Happy holidays,
everybody.
Merry Christmas. all.
Happy New Year's and happy capital budgeting.
Yes.